look at some other issues that are in the news since the Supreme Court ruling. This question's for Paul. What do you think the right wing's next move will be now that it's becoming well established that government cannot discriminate against gay men and lesbians?
So where we are at this point is, as Lee just indicated, there's almost a consensus now that the government can't discriminate against LGBT people. And we're moving into a world in which the government is increasingly going to be telling private citizens they can't discriminate against LGBT people. And the next big fight, and this is going to be quite a protracted and complicated fight, is going to be in response to the right wing's move, which is to claim that they are victims of discrimination, religious discrimination, because they are being told they have to tolerate us, and they have to do business with us. They have to rent apartments to us, and they have to take pictures at our weddings like everybody else's. In New Mexico, there was a case. And they have to hire us. And so what you're going to see, and we're already starting to see, is claims that under the First Amendment provisions that protect free exercise of religion, they should be able to claim an exemption from any law that requires them to in some way tolerate or be friendly to or do business with gay people. And this is going to be fought out. It is part of a larger narrative that the right wing has tried to establish, which is that they're the real victims here, and the all-powerful gay lobby and their politically correct friends are taking over the world and punishing anybody who threatens to oppose them or signs a petition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They love this feeling of victimization, and the religious element of it is a huge part of it. The leading edge of these cases will probably be decided not in cases about gay people, though, but the case that's going to be in the Supreme Court very soon, they're coming up through a number of the different circuits, involves whether or not a private company can claim a right under the First Amendment to refuse to follow the Affordable Care Act, particularly the provision that requires that insurance that is provided to employees include contraceptive coverage. And so that issue and our issues are going to be very interestingly and inextricably tied together. We saw a decision just the other week from what many people call the second most important court in America, the D.C. Circuit, which said indeed the Freshway Corporation, which is just a private corporation that does regular plain old business, because it is owned by two Catholics, has a federal constitutional right to violate the Health Care Act and not give people contraceptive coverage, even along with all the rest of the coverage that they give. Now, this is really, I think, an extraordinary, extreme position. It's not like anybody is being forced to use birth control that doesn't want to use birth control or otherwise violate some tenet of their faith. They're simply, all that the law says is, if you're in business and you choose to provide people insurance, you have to provide comprehensive insurance. And there are many people who need contraception for health reasons, among other things. And so I think in the end of the day, that's where the leading edge of this issue is going to be decided. I know you kind of agree with me on this, Kevin, but we should keep an eye on those cases because they will be in the court very soon. And I think this fight over religion and the right to be exempt from equality requirements is going to be a long drawn-out battle that we're going to have to keep fighting. Something for Lambda Legal to do.
Absolutely. We're on it. We're on it. But I'd like to just add a little bit to that because I think a lot of the times if you follow in the gay press the stories about this, you get the impression that all of the problems that come up have been about either florists or wedding cake bakers, cupcake factories, and that sort of thing. And there certainly have been a number of those cases, and they get a lot of attention. But I think the real issues here are much larger employers, things like colleges and universities that are connected to a religious body, hospital networks that are connected in some way to a religious body, that are looking for a way out, which means that if you're a billing clerk in a hospital, if you work in the admissions office at a university, if you're a janitor at a school, that somehow the school would then, or the hospital would be able to discriminate against you on the basis of sexual orientation because of this religious affiliation. So when you hear these stories, and people often sort of chuckle or they say, oh, why don't they get a different photographer? That's just the tip of the iceberg of where the problems are. And we're seeing this both in The passage of legislation, particularly, for example, we've mentioned Hawaii already and the fact that Hawaii is not done yet. And the reason Hawaii isn't done yet is because the House in Hawaii passed the bill first, the marriage bill, and it had a very narrow religious exclusion, broader than I would have liked, but livable. It was reasonable. The Senate, I'm sorry, it was the Senate. When it went to the House broadened the religious exclusion. It's not the worst one in the country by any means, but they broadened it, and the reason that the bill is not finished yet is because it has to go back to the Senate. Now, we are pretty much assured that the Senate is going to accept the House version because the House is never going to accept the Senate version. And this will be a big step forward for people in Hawaii. However, the religious exclusion has been expanded in the process, and that's why this is taking longer. You may also have seen coverage about some of the controversy about the current incarnation of ENDA, which just had its vote in the Senate, very historic and groundbreaking. It has a large religious exclusion. Even the New York Times has editorialized against this religious exclusion as being too broad. Now, I wish I could be worried that the House was about to pass this bill and it was going to be signed into law and we were going to have to deal with this religious exclusion in the near term. That's not my biggest worry right now. But the fact is that the bill that has been moving forward is extremely problematic for us. And I say that from a legal organization perspective because I know what's going to happen if this bill became law. A lot of people would get coverage against employment discrimination, which is an enormous problem in our community. At our help desks in all of our offices across the country, we get about 7,000 calls a year from people who are facing discrimination. The largest number of calls year in and year out is about employment discrimination. And that hasn't changed in years. I don't expect that it will. But people are going to come to us saying, well, now there's a federal law, how are you going to help me? And we're going to say, well, you work for that hospital, you work for that school, you work for that company, you work for that baker or religious photographer or whoever, and we're going to then find out how big the gaps are. So this is something that we need to continue to struggle with as a community, and we need to fight out state by state as we are passing legislation, whether it's marriage legislation or whether it's anti-discrimination legislation. And one of my concerns about what happens in Washington, D.C. and what happens with ENDA is it's very hard once we sort of set a ceiling, or maybe it's a floor, on a federal level. It's hard to go to people in the states who are trying to pass similar legislation and say, no, you have to hold a harder line, because it's just hard for them to do that. And they point to what happened in Washington and say, well, it was okay in Washington, why isn't it okay, in XYZ state, wherever they are? So these things have a way of spreading, and they have a way of dragging each other down. And it's important that we work to get legislation that encompasses as much protection for as many of us as is possible.